On the morning of August 14th, 1948, a twin-engine Beechcraft climbed over the mountains of central Idaho, and a wooden box tumbled out of the open door. A parachute snapped open above it, and inside that box, falling toward a wilderness with no roads, no trails, and no people, was a live beaver. His name was Geronimo, and he was not the last. Over the next few days, 76 beavers would drop out of the Idaho sky, swinging under surplus war parachutes, headed for a valley most people had never seen. It sounds like a joke. A magazine at the time literally called them para-beavers. But this was not a stunt, and it was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a desperate fix to a problem people had created themselves. And what those 76 animals built in that hidden basin would turn out to be worth millions of dollars. It would outlast the men who dropped them. And nearly 80 years later, the same government that once paid trappers to wipe beavers off the map would be spending real money by hand, trying to bring them back. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll understand why we spent a century killing the one animal that was quietly solving the exact problems we're now paying fortunes to fix. To understand why a wildlife officer was throwing beavers out of an airplane, you have to go back to the end of the Second World War. Soldiers were coming home, and a lot of them looked at a place like McCall, Idaho, on the shore of Payette Lake, and saw paradise. Clean water, tall pines, cheap land. They started building cabins and homes along the shoreline. There was just one problem. Beavers had been living there for centuries. And a beaver does what a beaver does. It cuts down trees. It dams up streams. It floods the low ground to make a pond. To a family trying to protect a new house and a young orchard, the animal in the creek was not a marvel of nature. It was a pest, chewing through everything they owned. So the complaints poured into the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. And the easy answer, the answer most states reached for back then, was simple: kill them. But the people at Fish and Game knew something most homeowners didn't. Beavers were not the enemy. They cleaned the water. They held the soil in place. They built the wetlands that fed the birds and the fish. The smarter move wasn't to destroy the beavers. It was to move them somewhere they were actually needed. And one man was about to find out just how hard that would be. His name was Elmo Heter, and he worked for Fish and Game out of the McCall area. He knew beavers better than almost anyone in the state, and he knew exactly where these troublemakers belonged. A place called the Chamberlain Basin, deep in the Idaho backcountry, in what we now call the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. It was perfect beaver country, quiet, wet, wheeled, and almost completely empty of people. There was only one catch. There were no roads, none. You could not drive a truck into the Chamberlain Basin, and the traditional way of moving beavers, the way every state used, was already a nightmare even on flat ground. Trappers caught the animals, loaded them into crates, and hauled them out by truck, then by horse and mule over the mountains. It did not work. Heter watched it fail again and again. The beavers overheated in their boxes and had to be soaked with water to keep them alive. The trips dragged on for days, and the mules hated it. In his own report, Heter wrote that horses and mules become, in his words, spooky and quarrelsome when loaded with a struggling, odorous pair of live beavers. The animals would buck and fight. Beavers died on the trail. It was slow, it was expensive, and far too many beavers never made it. So Heter sat with the problem, and he kept coming back to one thing he had lying around in piles, left over from the war: parachutes. Thousands of surplus military parachutes, cheap and just sitting there. What if, he thought, you skipped the roads entirely? What if you just flew the beavers in and dropped them out of the sky? The idea sounds reckless, but Heter was careful. His real challenge was the box. He needed a container that could hold 2 beavers safely through a fall, then open by itself the moment it hit the ground, so nobody had to hike in to free them. His first idea was a box woven from willow, figuring the beavers could chew their way out. He scrapped it fast when he realized they might chew through it in midair and fall to their deaths. So he engineered something better. 2 lidless wooden boxes, hinged together like a suitcase, with breathing holes drilled through the sides. Heavy elastic bands ran along the bottom and up the walls, holding the case shut against the rush of the fall. The instant it struck the earth, the tension released, and the box sprang open on its own. Simple, tough, beaver-proof. But it had never been tested with a real animal. And that is where Geronimo comes in. Geronimo was an older male beaver, and he became Heter's test pilot. They sealed him in the box, took him up, and dropped him. Then they picked him up and did it again, and again, over and over. Geronimo rode the parachute down to a flying field, while Heter studied each landing and fine-tuned the design. The beaver, somehow, took it in stride. Heter wrote that the poor fellow eventually became resigned to it. As soon as the box opened and the crew walked up, Geronimo would simply crawl back inside, ready to go up one more time. When Heter was finally certain it worked, the real operation began. On the morning of August 14th, 1948, 8 crates of beavers were loaded into the Beechcraft, along with a pilot and a conservation officer. Geronimo went first, and this time he wasn't alone. 3 female beavers rode down with him into the basin. The drop worked, the box opened, and just like that, a brand new beaver colony had a home in the middle of nowhere. Over the following days, the plane went back up again and again. 76 beavers in all floated down into the Chamberlain Basin. And here is the number that matters. 75 of them survived. There was only 1 death in the entire operation. 1 beaver clawed its way out of the box while it was still in the air, slipped loose, and fell. Every other animal landed safely and walked off into the wild. And then the beavers did the only thing beavers know how to do. They went to work. They felled trees, they dammed the streams, they flooded the low meadows and turned them into ponds. Slow water spread out across the basin. Green wetlands rose where there had been dry, cracked channels, and the whole operation had cost almost nothing. Dropping 4 beavers ran about $30 at the time. It was paid for largely through a tax on hunting and fishing gear, the Pittman-Robertson Fund, money from sportsmen that still pays for wildlife work in this country today. The drops were even captured on film, a reel called Fur for the Future, narrated in that classic old newsreel voice, describing the box opening and a most unusual trip ending for Mr. Beaver. And then, strangely, that film vanished. It was mislabeled, boxed up, and lost inside the state archives for more than 60 years. It wasn't until 2015 that a fish and game historian named Sharon Clark finally tracked it down and put it online. The world went a little bit crazy for it. Time magazine called the beaver the internet's newest favorite animal. But the parachuting beavers are only half the story, and the second half is the part that should stop you cold. Because to really understand what Idaho did in 1948, you have to know what we had already done to the beaver. Before Europeans arrived, North America held somewhere in the range of tens of millions of beavers, and quite possibly far more. They lived in nearly every stream on the continent, and then came the fur trade. Beaver felt made the finest hats in the world, and for 200 years, we trapped these animals relentlessly to feed that demand. By the year 1900, the continent's entire beaver population had crashed to roughly 100,000. We had come within a whisker of erasing them for good. And when the beavers disappeared, so did everything they built. The ponds drained, the wetlands dried out. The slow water that used to soak into the ground and feed the springs all summer long started rushing straight through and away. We had ripped out the animal that built the plumbing of the American West, and we barely noticed it was gone. Which brings us to the discovery that flipped this entire story on its head. Because decades later, scientists finally sat down and measured what a beaver pond actually does. And the results were almost impossible to believe. Researchers studying ponds in the Columbia Basin found that a single beaver pond doesn't just hold the water you can see on the surface. Underneath it, soaked into the ground, one pond can store as much as 6.7 million gallons of water. Put that in human terms. The water held by one average beaver pond, above and below the surface, in a single year, is enough to supply one person for more than 200 years. And that water doesn't just sit there. It seeps out slowly, cold and clean, all through the dry summer, keeping streams alive while the creeks without beavers run dry and crack in the heat. Then came the wildfire research, and this is where it gets remarkable. An eco-hydrologist named Emily Fairfax studied major wildfires across 5 western states, Idaho among them, and compared the land around beaver ponds to the land without them. What she found is that beaver country simply does not burn the same way. The beavers spread water out across the whole valley through the little channels they dig, almost like irrigation lines, and they keep the plants so green and so wet that fire struggles to move through them at all. Her study had a perfect name. She called it Smokey the Beaver. The footage is stunning. A wildfire tears across a dry landscape, blackening everything in its path. And then it reaches a beaver wetland and just stops, leaving a green island floating in a sea of ash. In one massive Colorado fire, the beaver ponds were almost the only living thing left standing. Fairfax found that land with beavers was about 3 times less damaged by fire than land without them. The animal we nearly wiped out for a hat turns out to be one of the best firefighters in the West. And it works for free. So here is the irony that ties the whole thing together. After spending a century paying people to trap beavers out of existence, we are now spending real money trying to put them back. Entire organizations like the Methow Beaver Project in Washington State have raised well over $1 million just to catch nuisance beavers, pair them up, and release them where they're needed most. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service launched a program with the only half-joking name Leave It to Beaver. And when we can't get a real beaver to move into a broken stream, we now do something that would have left Elmo Heter shaking his head. We build fake beaver dams by hand. They're called beaver dam analogs. Crews hammer wooden posts down across a creek and weave willow branches through them, building a clumsy human imitation of a structure a real beaver throws up overnight, for nothing. We are paying work crews by the hour to pretend to be beavers. Which means those 76 animals that fell out of the Idaho sky in 1948 were never a punchline. They were 30 years ahead of the science. While the rest of the country was still busy killing beavers, Idaho was quietly seeding a wilderness with the exact engineers that wilderness needed. And the dams they built in the Chamberlain Basin are still out there, still holding water, still slowing fire, in what has become the largest protected roadless forest in the lower 48 states. We spent 200 years seeing the beaver as one of 2 things, a hat or a nuisance. And the entire time, it was doing the precise work we would one day spend millions of dollars and countless hours trying to recreate by hand. The smartest water engineer in North America was never something we needed to build. It was something we just needed to stop killing. Geronimo, the old beaver who was dropped again and again until he stopped fighting it, has no marked grave out there. But somewhere in that quiet basin, underwater he helped create, his descendants may still be building, working through the night, asking for nothing, solving a problem we are only now finally smart enough to understand. If this story changed the way you see that little animal in the pond down the road, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because the next one is already on its way.